To begin, I'm going to use my circle maker to make a circle along the bottom of the page, and this is going to be the outline of the pumpkin. We're going to refine this in just a little bit. After that, I'm going to roughly draw in a witch's hat, and you can see here it's just a very rough drawing. Now we are going to refine our pumpkin just a little bit. I don't want this pumpkin to be perfectly round. I want it to have a little bit of character. So I am going to round out the edges and then add some of the grooves of the pumpkin. And as you can see, I am going around the edges of the bottom. I'm flattening out the bottom just a little bit more. This is typically how I make a pumpkin. I just start with a circle and then I refine it afterwards. I don't want any of the sides to be perfectly round either, so I am refining those as well. Use your eraser to erase any of the guidelines from the circle that you've made. Once you are satisfied with the shape and look of your pumpkin, we are going to take this one area at a time. So for that first piece of the pumpkin, you can see I split my pumpkin up into roughly four pieces. For that first area, all the way on the left, I am completely wetting the inside of it. And I am going to start with Cydonia, and I am going to saturate my brush with it and start working my way along the edges of it first. Once the paint on my brush starts to lighten, I'm going to pull some of that color in. And just because I don't really want to waste any of the paint, but we are going to make sure that the outer edge of the pumpkin is as dark as you can make it. And the same goes for the bottom edge. And this is going to create a natural shadow for the pumpkin. Then I'm going to go in with Poppy, which is a sort of orangey yellow, and I am going to paint the inside of that pumpkin. You don't have to paint it perfectly uniform. Leave it a little splotchy. We want the pumpkin to have a more natural feel to it, and pumpkins aren't uniformly orange and, just one color and, perfect. I mean, if you have one of those perfect pumpkins, tipping my hat off to you. But we're throwing in some Cydonia inside of the yellow and some Poppy as well. And as we're going along, I am also darkening the outer edge of it. I'm not going to wait for this first piece to dry. I'm just gonna go straight to the one next to it. So again, I'm going to water down the inside of this section, just as we did with the first one. You'll see that once the water hits that edge of the first one, you're gonna have paint running into it, and that's perfectly okay. We want to have the paint flow and kind of mix and do its own thing because we want the pumpkin to have a more natural feel. We're gonna go back into the Cydonia and saturate the brush with it. And with Cydonia, it doesn't really take a lot to saturate the brush. It just takes a dip or two of your brush because this is a very potent pigment. So I am going to, once again, make it the darkest at the edge. And if it bleeds into the other side again, that's okay. And we're going to clean off our brush in the middle of the pumpkin. So we're just gonna drag some of that color in. And then we are going to, once again, add some poppy. Once you have added the amount of poppy that you'd like into the middle of it, we're gonna go back in with some Cydonia and add just a little bit here and there. Again, we wanna make sure that we keep the edges as dark as possible because the edges are kind of where the shadow is going to be, and it's going to give it that feel of like kind of like a sectioned off part of the pumpkin, an indentation on the pumpkin. You know what I'm saying. So the bottom as well is going to be just a little bit darker with more of that orange Cydonia in it, because again, we want to show some shadow and some depth in those areas. So we're going to continue doing that for the next 2 sections, or however many sections you have. And remember, we're going to be working wet on wet for the entire bottom, for the entire pumpkin. So you don't have to dry any of the areas as you go along. Just keep doing it wet on wet and adding a little bit of texture with the orange and a base of that yellow orange, which is the poppy. Once you are satisfied with the look of your pumpkin, then you can go ahead and completely dry it with a hairdryer or just let it dry on its own. Now I am going to pencil in the buckle on the hat because I forgot to do that in the beginning. So as you can see, as I'm penciling in the sash or the ribbon on the hat, I'm going a little bit outside of the hat to give it a more realistic look. So just curve the edges a little outside of the hat. And then I am just going to pencil in a rectangle for the buckle. So once I have that roughly sketched in, I am going to take some indigo and start painting wet on dry. So you'll see while I'm painting the hat with indigo that what I'm doing is I am putting a lot of saturation on some areas and then I'm watering down other areas. And I'm doing this purposefully because I, again, don't want the hat to be completely uniform. I want some light areas, I want some dark areas, I want some splotchy areas. I just kind of want a little bit more texture than just a flat hat. We are going to do a little galaxy-esque type design on the hat, so you want to give it a little bit more texture. So water down some areas, add a lot of paint in other areas, and don't make it all completely uniform. Once I've completed painting the hat, I'm going to take some Copic opaque white and just splatter some in. There's going to be some areas that have already started drying, and then there's going to be some areas that are completely saturated with paint, such as the top. And again, that's okay because we don't want this to be completely uniform. Don't forget to paint the little piece inside of the buckle, like I almost forgot to do here. Once this is completely dry, I am going to take some Poppy and paint the buckle with Poppy. I'm not going to wait for it to dry. I'm going to continue on, and if the paint runs in, that's okay as well. I'm going to take some Cydonia and paint the ribbon with Cydonia. And again, it's going to run into the buckle because the buckle is still wet, and that's kind of the look that I'm going for. Make sure that your piece is completely dry before moving on to the next one. So I'm going to take my Sharpie fine liner and I'm going to do a really, really rough outline of the entire piece. And when I say rough, I mean rough. I am going to let some of the lines go into the hat and into the pumpkin and some out of the pumpkin. I am just going to make this kind of like as sloppy as possible. And I've always loved the look of illustrations that have like these rough lines around them. So that's what we're going for. I'm purposefully making it, you know, sloppy and letting some of those lines show. Don't forget to do the buckle and the ribbon. Once I get down to the pumpkin, the outside of the pumpkin, I'm going to have solid lines. But once we get into the inside of the pumpkin, I am not going to have a solid line along those shaded areas. So you can see I'll put some dots, some dashes, and I just want to keep that very, very rough on the inside. I don't want to cover up a lot of the shading that we did earlier. All right, now we're going to add a little bit of texture on the outside of the pumpkin, and I'm going to do that by loading my size 4 brush. So we're moving up to a size 4 now. I'm loading my size 4 brush up with some Cydonia, and I'm splattering around the outside edges of the pumpkin. And then after I splatter a little bit, I'm loading that brush up with water, and I am just kind of like dabbing it across the paper. No rhyme or reason. I just want this to look a little bit sloppy and a little bit, just make it look like there's just some texture there. So you can achieve it by adding lots of water and running your brush along the paper. And then on top of that, add a little bit of splatter and let that paint just kind of flow in. Along the bottom, I'm doing the same thing with Poppy. And I'm also splattering some Poppy along the pumpkin. To finish this piece off, I'm going to grab my white gel pen and dot in some stars and add some constellations. So these are obviously not real constellations. I didn't really want to look up, sometimes I do, sometimes I'll look up the shapes of constellations and make them true to form. I'm not doing that here. So just a couple of lines here and there, and adding it along the top of the hat and along the brim of the hat, and I'll also be adding in a couple of stars. So I'm just keeping it very, very simple and not too realistic. And after I've added in the stars, I'm done. So I hope you enjoyed this very quick and simple tutorial, and I'll see you soon with the next one.